There you go. Last week, we did talk about reflection, writing reflectively. The idea is then that you're keeping a reflective journal. This could be a physical notebook where you are constantly, reflecting on the materials you are engaging with, your past experiences. You could, in that reflective journal, keep a bit more of details of the things that you are exploring and exploring about yourself as an online learner, as somebody who has engaged in online learning in the past. The idea is that then if you keep this reflective journal, then the second assignment that we have is going to be easier to write because you have kept tracked and documented your learning process. We discussed ideas around video in distance education, how students engage with video, the reasons they might not engage in video, and what we can do as tutors, online tutors, to encourage the use of video. Now, what I liked about one of the articles is the idea of encouragement rather than make things mandatory, because we never know what kind of situations students may have. And one of the key points as well that were mentioned is that, how sometimes in plenary, which is, this kind of presentation where the tutor is and that all the students are there, sometimes it kind of leads itself for students to just keep their cameras off. But when we are working in groups, and suddenly the room becomes a little bit more alive. Successful online learners and active online learning. These are topics that we have also covered last week. And in these topics, you engaged in different forums in Canvas, where you were reflecting about your online experiences in the past and the current experience as we get along with the course unit, teaching and learning online as well. So some of your conversations were about, making sure that you are more self-disciplined, that, the realization that there's a lot of commitment. You need to have that commitment and motivation to really engage with materials and the tutors and other peers, because you're doing this because you want to do this for yourself, for your own development. There were also ideas discussed as well in the readings that you also brought up to those discussions around, self-discipline and taking control of your learning experience. So management skills, how you're going to manage the time that you have to engage with materials online, engage with your peers, get in contact with the tutor as well. The idea of multitasking, somebody mentioned, in one of the forums is how difficult it is nowadays with different apps and different notifications to really focus as you get a notification in WeChat, WhatsApp, or Facebook, or Instagram, or whatever it is that you're using with these social media. Is sometimes a bit difficult to concentrate. But then how you mitigate those situations is what's important to plan for. As the idea is then that you make space to dedicate and focus on engaging actively, proactively. That's why, called active online learning, being proactive, doing things to help yourself in the process, specifically if you are the kind of person who really struggles to have that kind of self-discipline. It's kind of relearning how you learn best and helping yourself in the process. So this module, which is module 2 that we're starting today in Canvas, starts with week 3. And the idea is that we reflect on the use of technology and how it can help enhance the learning experience. So when we are talking about online learning, if we're tutors, or if we in the future want to create an online course, we do need to think about what kind of technology is best. And for that, we need to look at different factors. We need to consider not only, what your characteristics and personality as a teacher you may have, because that influences our decision-making process. So we look into what's important to us, what kind of tools we have utilized in the past, but also we need to look at, institutionally, what are the kind of tools that the institution can pay for. Because at the end of the day, a lot of the institutions, organizations involved, they might pay for a digital technology that you have never used, that you probably don't like, and you need to use it. So how do you go about those decisions as well? And, how do you engage with those technologies that might not be of your liking as well? So reflecting on technology, what kind of factors we need to consider to make those decisions, as course creators, but also as students. So if you're not or have never created a course, which we will do it during this course unit around week 6 and 7, we start thinking about course unit. But now with your experiences of online learning, what kind of tools you have identified that are good for your learning? So you have experience now working with Canvas and Blackboard. So the idea is then that you yourself compare what do you think is, has worked for you? What kind of things have worked for you and why? So again, reflecting on the rationale behind whether Blackboard was best suited for your learning, whether any other kind of learning management system that you have used in the past was better for you. Somebody mentioned, I think it was you, Olkar, of using MOOCs. So you have also kind of had that experience of how MOOCs are organized, what kind of activities are embedded, kind of interactions. So the idea is that you take that experience and then start comparing, looking at the affordances. We're going to look at the term affordance in this session, and what were the challenges. And then you think about, as an online learner, what worked for you, what didn't work, why, and what would you do in the future if you were, again, to be a student in an online environment, and then you need to engage with technologies that are similar to the ones you have engaged in the past. So how are you going to overcome the challenges that you encountered in the past? It's important to plan for those things. And the idea of reflection is there because, we sometimes don't get to reflect, don't get that time and practice to reflect. As we reflect and develop critical thinking, we're also developing skills to then make decisions. You develop skills that are analytical, you evaluate information, and then you take decisions for the future. Right, so 3 key aspects. We are exploring some terminology that you guys might be familiar with already, might not be familiar. You might have heard of this terminology before, read about it. Then we're going to think about digital tools in online learning, and tools, and more tools. Today is all about tools. Yes. So key terminology: distance education, distributed education, blended learning. Have you heard of any of these terminologies? Yeah. What kind of ideas do you have so far about any of the 3? Any of, if you blended learning is familiar to you, what kind of things do you know about blended learning, for instance? Okay. Yes, Olkar?
So we have actually blended learning units. So you can blend in different ways, but the common terminology is like you blend face-to-face and online.
Yes.
But you also can blend like series of learning, like constructionism, behaviorism. It's also kind of learning, or media. You can add media. You also can blend traditional with the media. So
exactly, I like that. So it's kind of understanding that people will engage in education either face-to-face or online, You said there are older ways of doing it, but this is a kind of common shared understanding so far in the literature as well, and how it's easier to define. Now, some people might use distance education instead of distributed education because they do share characteristics as well. Or some people might think about distance education in the same way they think about blended learning. And that's because in academia, people define differently terminology that is used as, we see there all the time, but they just think about it differently. Let's have a look at, thank you for that contribution. Let's look at this figure here. So we have then that distance education. If we start with distance education, we have keywords such as access to education, access to study resources, and the expert tutor instruction. What does that mean then? Distance education is having access to resources. And expert, tutor instruction. So for instance, imagine a world where there was no technology as we have today. So if we go back to the 70s, 80s, where, probably there was not much engagement with online resources, and we go back to the, those cassettes and those big cassettes of video. If a person really wanted to continue their education, we're talking about adults who were employed, who were working, but they wanted to continue their studies, they would probably pay to an institution to give them access to those materials and resources. So they would get, books for them to have access to the different, course units that they had. They probably would be given cassettes or, HIVs for them to watch in their own time. So that's the idea of accessing to resources. Now, with the development of technology, that accessibility opened lots of doors. So basically, the idea of distance education is access to resources, access as well to tutors. In the past, access to tutors could have been, tutors sending actual letters to students and communicating through letters. And that's how we think about distance education traditionally. Now, these people who engage in this kind of education, the key word is that they were employed and they wanted to continue working at their own pace in their own time, as well following the deadlines of those, institutions they attached to. So the idea of study where and where they wanted is the kind of idea behind distance education. And the communication was between the organization or the institutions and the tutors and the students. So that's the kind of interaction they had in the past. Those ideas are still relevant. But let's move on to the idea of distributed learning and how it is different from distance education. So in distributed learning, we have keywords as well there. We have instructor and students connect and conduct the learning process from separate locations. So then we can look at the idea of people who are geographically separated. So somebody from Mexico interacting with somebody from Canada, and somebody from China, and somebody from, some other location. So the idea of connecting and conducting learning from different separate locations. So instruction then would happen independently of time and location. So they came together and worked together. As well, then, we have more keywords, more ideas. Learning takes place regardless of place and time, which I already read. And also this one here, it can occur on or off campus. So that meant that in this kind of distributed learning, we could have people who were studying on-site or full-time students, and also part-time students or distance learners. They can as well connect, come together, and interact through different synchronous or asynchronous tools. Now, this idea then, as technology developed, then it came more, relevant, I think, distributed learning. Now, in this unit, teaching and learning online, we have a combination of distance education and distributed learning. We do have on-site students, distance learners. We also have that, some people are located in various parts of the world. But we also have, people who are in the same country, England, for instance. There's a lot of people located in different, north, south, east of England and Scotland as well. So there you go. Then it takes us then to this idea of blended learning, which Ulker defined really well. It refers to integrating face-to-face and online instruction. So a combination of instructional modalities, ways to deliver. It can also include media, as Ulker mentioned, combination of educational methods as well. So it's all about combination. What these all three terminologies have in common is the idea of communication is of two kinds. It's either asynchronous or asynchronous. This is just in more details of, the things that we've already covered. So details about distance education, access to study resources, study when and where you want. There is a non-continuous communication. If we think about back in the days, people exchanging letters, well, that's uncontinuous, it's kind of asynchronous and waiting for the letter to arrive. Now with technology, this is the same. The tutor's waiting for you to put a post so that they can comment on it. So it is not, synchronously, but it has that asynchronous element, which we need to mitigate as well. The idea of communication being as, two-way traffic, they call it. One-way traffic first is, there's pre-produced materials that are available to students. So in this case, for instance, we have Canvas, all that different units that we will cover during the 12 weeks, they're already available to you to look at any point in time. To engage with these materials in advance, it depends on how you want to interact with this. But also two-way traffic, so real communication, which is the one we have today in our online seminars. And then more of the same things that we've mentioned with other people defining what distributed learning is, like Kirkley, talks about synchronous and asynchronous tools occurring either on campus or off campus, having access to materials, the instructor, support, students connect and conduct learning process. So same things we've already mentioned. And then we have blended learning, integrating face-to-face online instruction, combining ways of communication. It is also about combining modalities of instructional pedagogy, instructional methods as well. It's not just face-to-face and online. It involves a lot of different other layers that we've mentioned before. Now, open if everybody has access to this slide, but if you look at this infographic here, which I'm going to open, we look at the different generations of distance education. So we have the first generation, which is, as I mentioned, we look at the timeline of, of our world before technology. It is about, people communicating through mail, making use of the postal system. Instructions were delivered by mail as well. Some people had access to specific programs that were catered for people taking those courses. So they might have, created a 10-minute input, and they would, put it on television or radio, and people would be told, listen to this, to the radio at this hour, and so on and so forth. Then we have our second broadcast radio and television, which luckily I had, I have some experience with. So in this case, people, move away from mail exchange and getting those packages delivered to the use of more radio, more television. So basically, now a whole course unit would be delivered using television. And they were, these programs created for these people as well, who were engaging in distance education. They would also receive some materials by mail, because there was always this notion of, people need that kind of textbook or kind of exercises to complete or to read, or handouts and so on and so forth. But the delivery was in that mode, television, broadcast, radio as well. Then we go into the third generation or open universities. This is where technology is at its height. So we talk about video technologies. We talk about engagement with synchronous and asynchronous tools. The idea of teleconferencing is the idea that was more relevant when we move from the third to the fourth generation, which, they kind of happen very close together. And that's because technology developed really, really fast as well. So teleconferencing, which is some of the things that we have discussed, video conferencing, people coming together in probably Skype. A long time ago, there were other tools that people used before the pandemic. We had Adobe Connect, we had Skype, people creating these spaces to interact with one another. Did they have the same issues? If you go back and look at the literature, yes, they also had issues with people engagement, but still people who wanted to have this education attended the sessions. And then, with the internet, we have a plethora, a lot of possibilities, because there's a lot of tools that are available to us. And now the dilemma is, what tools should I choose based on the courses, of the learning outcomes, of my students' needs? So you need to consider a lot of factors. So that's that there for you to explore as well. So you can click on that link. There is a question in the chat box. I'm gonna. Yeah. Yes, it was made with AI. Yeah. So if we want to look at an example, which is what you read in Canvas this week, before DTC, before the Master in Digital Technologies, Communication and Education began in 2007, the TESOL Master, the TESOL group, had created their own distance education materials. So we're going back to the 1980s, where, that first generation, people interacted, tutors interacted with students, with, they developed self-contained packages, they developed all the materials students needed to engage with, to have that learning. That again, we've talked about this, when we engage in online learning, distance education, the idea is that the students are doing these things because they want to learn. So they're doing it in a self-directed way. So self-contained packages delivered by mail, that happened back in the 80s. And then they also moved to the second generation of distance education, this MA TESOL group. So they started engaging with, probably not cassettes, but, the floppy disks and the CD-ROOMs. And they, again, engage in that process of sending these materials by email, have that interaction, more around the 90s and so on. Through the use of email, and they started as well getting into that kind of exchange in the fourth and fifth generations. But also in the third generation, there was engagement with the TESOL group and students as well, where there was this teleconferencing communication happening as well as email, as I mentioned before. So yeah, that's interesting because whoever was working behind all of these things, in that case, I remember Gary did a lot of this work in the MA TESOL program, Gary Motaram. And then also Gary started, creating together with other colleagues the MA DTCE. But he already had that experience in the TESOL program with Diane Sloughty and other tutors as well. So that kind of help created the basis to then create the DTCE program. So if you didn't know this history about how the TESOL program and the DTCE program are connected, they are connected. That's a relationship that probably you've never been told about, but we are learning about that in this course, that relationship, which, is important as well to recognize. When we think about tools, we need to think about them as, their relationship. What is the tool? What is the relationship between the tool and my purposes? So these are things that we're going to discuss when we start engaging in course design, and we start asking students to think about a course unit that they want to deliver as a group, and what would be the learning outcomes of that course unit. So you need to think about, what are the purposes of your course unit? What do you want students to be able to achieve at the end of the course unit? So you will start creating your learning outcomes for that course unit. And we will look at how to create learning outcomes. If you don't have that experience, we will guide you through the process. But if you do have experience creating learning outcomes, then think about, the purposes. So before you even think about technology, thinking about those learning outcomes. What do you want your students to be able to achieve? And the next question is, how would you help your students to get there? What are the tools that are more appropriate to use to help your students to achieve those learning outcomes? That's why we start with the learning outcomes and not with the technology, because that would be a bit weird to think about that, I'm going to use this technology without a purpose. So what gives you purpose is to think about what you want students to be able to achieve. And then you think about what tools are going to help you achieve or help your students achieve those learning outcomes. So I like to put some, visuals as well. So we start with learning outcomes. We start with the design of the course. If your course has 10 modules, what are the purposes of these 10 modules? And if you have observed, for instance, when we started this, every week we start with our sessions. So far, we always start with sessions, and we always start with every module has aims and LOs. Those LOs as that's what we call learning outcomes. It is important then that as you think about the learning outcomes of your course unit, and also the particular learning outcomes of the different modules that form the structure of your course unit, for instance, you need to then not only develop these learning outcomes, but also think about how technologies, what are the best technologies that are available and you have access to, because that's what we need to think about, accessibility. Are these technologies available in our teaching context? What are these technologies that are available to us, and how can we utilize them to help us achieve the learning outcomes that we have produced? So that's why we talk about that relationship between tool and purpose, or purpose and then tool. Now, if we look at the factors that influence the decision-making process, we can look at, things such as the beliefs of the students, but also the beliefs of the teachers about the use of certain technologies. I could have a really positive, strong belief that Canvas is better than, Blackboard, but you might think, no, actually, no. So as a tutor, how do you mitigate those beliefs? What do you do if students really don't want to use Canvas because they find it so difficult, but you want to utilize it? The feedback you have received is that students struggle with it, or the contrary, that they really like it, that they really find it useful and easier to use, but then your institution tells you you cannot use it. You need to go back to Blackboard. So again, we have the institutional setting. Institutions have some power in that decision-making process, and sometimes there's nothing we can do as tutors. If the institution says we're going to move to MOOCs rather than Blackboard or Canvas, then we have to move to MOOCs, and there's nothing we can do whether we like it or not as tutors. But yes, some factors, there are more that we're going to discuss, but these are some of the factors that are influencing, the teacher decision making. Also, the expectation of students, we've talked about that, beliefs about learning. Now, I'm borrowing this slide from another course, so don't let this terminology distract you. We're focusing on the idea of beliefs, the idea of institutional setting, the idea of expectations. I'm going to correct that later on, but I think this is a picture, that's why I couldn't edit it. I will edit it later on. The factors influencing your decisions around tools is that one of, accessibility and affordances as well. We're going to discuss this idea of affordance. What is an affordance? The challenges perceived. We mentioned those factors that we cannot control, such as, the institutional setting. And yeah, we can think about more of other factors that I may have not written, but you might, think about other things that might affect as well. So the word affordance, have you ever heard this word now that you are in second semester?
Yes, we love this word.
Tell me about what you have heard about this word.
We have ETC course. It was one of the concepts there.
So I'm glad that someone, I don't know if the rest have heard it, maybe you don't remember, but yes. So the idea of affordance is that an affordance refers to what you individually perceive to be a property, something that is beneficial for, that has benefits, the benefits that you can see in how you can use a tool. So what I see as an affordance, and this is what I was mentioning before, how I see, if I see that, Blackboard has the affordance of having an interface where, the materials can be organized much better than Canvas, that's the affordance I perceive. And that doesn't mean that the same affordance I perceive, other people understand it or have it. So affordances are very individual, and it is about how, your perceptions about what kind of benefits you find in particular tools. So looking at those affordances that you might perceive about tools is important. It is something that will help you make decisions. So now, the contrary to affordances, everything else which is challenging, that might cause a struggle for people to engage with, we can then also consider. So it's almost like the good and the bad, looking at the affordances, looking at the challenges of specific tools, and that is basically an analytical process. So what things are good about a specific technology that you think are good for, because this is something you perceive, and what other things you perceive as, being negative or challenging about that tool, and how you make about, what kind of things you make and come up with after, that analytical process. Now we've talked about distance education, distance distributed learning, blended learning. And we also mentioned that these different modalities involve asynchronous and synchronous tools. And nowadays, the line and the division between what is asynchronous, what is synchronous might be a bit blurry, because we do have some technologies that combine, for instance, video conferencing aspects, but also they might offer you spaces for instant and messages, which you can then utilize, but people might do this asynchronously. So it's a bit blurry, that line between that division between synchronous and asynchronous. However, we still think about, for instance, online forums as asynchronous, because people do engage with them at different moments in time. Quizzes, polls, email, yes, that might be more asynchronous, because people might not be looking at their emails, responding right there and then. You might have an email sitting there waiting for you to respond for a week, for example, because you're busy doing other things. So when we talk then about asynchronous tools, we talk about the virtual classroom, live presentations, live text chat. So I might say to you, we're going to have this interaction live, which is something I might want to try for when we start moving away from Canvas and interacting with, other tools such as Teams or VoiceThread. So we might try other ways of interacting synchronously later on in this unit. The same, that's just here. These are some links that you can explore in your own time. If you're not familiar with all of these technologies, I provided some links there, but I'm also conscious that you can Google this, in your own time. But this is just for you to, get a sense of what other people have used as synchronous and asynchronous tools as well. More on tools and more tools. That's what we were saying before. Becoming more aware of what tools belong to that Web 1, to Web 2 design, or to Web 3. Do we know? I'm just saying, using this terminology, but I'm not sure if people are aware of what Web 1 is, Web 2 is, Web 3 is. Okay, new things to learn then. If you didn't know then, Web 1, when we talk about Web 1 tools, we talk about those tools that might be a bit older, in the sense that the technology is completely static. It contains information, but you cannot interact with this information. For example, a personal web page that you create, which you're just creating and you're just providing information about yourself. We have some examples here of Google, MSN, but it's basically read only. It's you open a window, you click on that, and it just gives you information. One example is, for instance, the news before they started incorporating conversational aspect. They only give information about the news. Nowadays it's different, that has changed, but it's a way of explaining what Web 1 could be. Sometimes blogs as well are could be seen as Web 1, so read only. Now Web 2, this is when we start thinking about this dynamic dimension of interaction. So it focuses on the ability for people to collaborate, to share information. We can include wikis, we can include social bookmarking, we can include Facebook, Instagram. So again, now people start to interact with Web 2. And Web 3, everything that is related with the intelligent web, artificial intelligence. So an example that I like to give is Amazon. Amazon has that, intelligent feature, because as it analyzes what you have bought in the past and suddenly gives you a suggestion. Other people have bought this. You might be interested in this. They analyze the data that you are putting to give you, again, to communicate with you. So it's a machine facilitated understanding of information. It gives you, produce something to try to have this contact with you. So that is the difference between Web 1, 2, and 3. Canvas, everything that doesn't have an online discussion could be considered like kind of Web 1, because you're just input. But then when we get to that modality of online discussions, then we can say it has that combination of Web 1 and 2 characteristics. Web 3, well, it does give you some analytics of how students are engaging with the content. So it does have kind of a little bit of an element of these different webs. A few figures for you to keep in mind as you think about tools, think about potential tools that you might want to use for your future development of course unit, but also for to think about your own engagement as an online learner. Some people in the discussions that we have in the last 2 weeks as homework, they were saying, oh, I'd like to be more disciplined in this. I want to be more engaged in this way. Well, part of that, those plans that people have discussed, the idea is then you operationalize that and you make it happen. You don't wait for the tutors to tell you how you should be engaging with things. You do it because you have learned how to use technologies effectively for your own purposes. So we have then that the penetration of social media, Facebook, first place still, that was in 2022, YouTube, most used social platforms, WhatsApp, Instagram, WeChat, TikTok, Facebook Messenger, and others, that are less used but still relevant. And that could depend on the different contexts in which we are located. Now, there's another link here that will give you a better view of that map. I recognize that is not the best screenshot I've taken, but we kind of still using a lot of Facebook around the world. There's that blue thing, America, North and South and Central, Europe, Asia. It's kind of still very, very pervasive. WeChat, China mostly. VK is mostly used in Russia as well. Instagram, more used in specific places. But yes, have a look at those, at the world map of social networks, because if these tools are really pervasive there, as teachers, as online learners, we might think about using them for our own purposes. So who has, for instance, used WeChat or WhatsApp to communicate with your study groups? I like the idea of asking me to, put in contact people, but then the idea is that you also utilize the social media available to engage with people within, the same course. So I would love to hear about how you created your own WeChat groups, WhatsApp groups, or as Ulkar mentioned as well, you have created a group in Canvas, so where you can interact with one another. More and more tools. I'm not going to go through all of them, but it is to become aware that the plethora of tools is amazing, and to decide which one is the ones that are more appropriate for your teaching context. It does take some time to think about these different factors. We're going to take a break before we get into the tools that Jane provides us. She gives a list of tools what tools are used for, you know, Office, for content development, for learning, for social collaboration. She kind of analyzes the different tools and she puts them there. There is a link to this information on our Canvas section. What section is? I know, I'm in the wrong thing. This bit here. At the end of this page, 2.1. So there is a link. There's also a video for you to look at and watch in your own, you know, in your own time. But we will talk about how you use tools. We will do this in group work. Hopefully there's enough people for each study group. And we will do that after the break. Shall we take a 10-minute break before we continue? 10 minutes, yeah? Excellent. We'll see you at 11:15. Idea then is how aware you are of utilizing them in a way that is beneficial for your own purposes. So I like, for instance, that you're very aware, you know, that it's from brainstorming whenever I'm, you know, I don't have anything in mind about a topic. Or probably some people use it as a way of kind of developing the structure, the skeleton of assignments. Paraphrasing, people do use that to help themselves paraphrase, especially when really they're dealing with hard terminology and it is hard to, you know, describe it in different ways.
Yeah, one of the way, for example, when I find the article is very hard for me to understand, so basically I put by paragraph, could you please tell me like in a simple way? So, or could you please give me an example, like analogy for it to understand it better?
Yes. There is, and I'm sure at this point in semester 2, most of you might be aware of utilizing ChatGPT academically in a purposeful way. So I'm going to open my tools. I'm going to no, it's not going to be here. But if you do a quick Google search on ChatGPT UOM, I always, you know, summarize UOM as University of Manchester, you will get some input about what people are talking about ChatGPT and how it is regarded and how we can use it as students academically. So far, the idea is that if you're using ChatGPT and it has a big role in how you develop assignments, for instance, you need to reference ChatGPT. So you need to make sure that you are acknowledging how you're utilizing it. And for this, you need a reference. And it has to appear in your reference list to show that kind of credibility of academic integrity and how you use this tool for your purposes. Cheating tool, contract cheating tool, there's another link here. A quick guide for staff, but there's also some guide for students about how to, reference ChatGPT if you're using it for your study. So I'm gonna put the links as well for you on the chat box for you to explore, because if you're not aware of these conversations that the university has regarding some tools, it's important that then you do become aware of them. Let's see, any other exclusive university approves ChatGPT. There's some news about that, but also, being aware of how we use those tools. Excellent, good. Any other ideas and comments on these questions that we have answered today as a group? Yeah? Okay, good. I sometimes go into the posts to make them a bit smaller. So don't worry if you see that instead of your name, it appears my name here. Sometimes I just make the make the entries, a bit smaller, and that's because sometimes it's scrolling down because there's so many posts. So just be aware of that. Just to finalize what the key ideas that I want you to take away from these sessions, this session today, and the key points of discussion. So in Canvas, you have read about transactional distance, and transactional distance is all about how we use the tools that we're using for our online studies in a way that they promote interaction. So what kind of interactive tools are you using for students to talk to one another? What kind of interaction tools you're using for students to engage with content? So in this case, we use Canvas. In this case, we also use the online discussions in Canvas, but we will be using VoiceThread and Microsoft Teams as well. And we have used Padlet as well. So what kind of tools you use to contact the tutor? Are you using the inbox in Canvas? Are you using the normal email? But also think about what kind of tools you might want to use so that these 3 types of interactions are present in your future course design, because I know a lot of you have mentioned that you are interested in online course design. So this gives us some food for thought to think about how we use them as learners, but also how we might use them as future course creators if this is one of your positions. Other questions, I have lots of questions that the idea is not for you to answer them, but think about as we are engaging again in reflection. We're getting into the reflective mode. Remember, reflection is a big dimension of the unit. So points to think about, to reflect on as you engage in online learning, both as teachers and current online learners as well. So to help you think about affordances and challenges, you could think about the modes of learning. So what kind of modes of learning you're engaging with. And you can think about the questions such as how could you select tools, how your selected tools affect the online learning. So as you mentioned, some of you said, well, I'm using ChatGPT. Have you used it in this course? How have you used it? Maybe to generate an entry in your discussion forum. So you could think about those ideas as well. Teacher roles. So how do tools affect the role of the teacher and teacher-student relationship? So what kind of impact do they have in that relationship that needs to be built as we interact with different online tools? As online learners, you could think about, your own competences. How are you engaging with tools? How much time you assign to get familiar with these tools, get comfortable using those tools. We've talked about last week about getting comfortable in front of a screen, using Zoom, using Canvas, getting comfortable about communicating your thoughts and opinions and reflections, seeing how other people communicate their own reflections, and probably, either modeling those entries or creating your own way of replying to those entries as well, in terms of discussion forums or online forums. Whether you are making connections, are you connecting the theory that you are exploring currently with your own experiences of online learning as a teacher and as a student? Are you making those connections? It is important that in order to push and get into a more reflective thinking, critical thinking, is that you are aware of how your own experiences, current and past, connect to the literature. And also things to reflect on, such as what we mentioned before, transactional distance. So what kind of tools enable you to interact with your peers, with your tutors, with the content. we have some ideas with that Bellarmine discusses in his work, but he does provide us a list of questions that we can ask ourselves as well as we think about tools and how to purposefully utilize them. So remember, we started this session about thinking about what are the learning outcomes that we want to achieve? What are the learning outcomes of the units that you engage with as online learner? Because you can think about this as the lecturer, the tutor, but you need to think about this as well as a student. So what are the learning outcomes of the whole course? What are the learning outcomes every week? And how am I utilizing the technologies I'm engaging with in a way that I am helping myself to achieve those learning outcomes? That's another way of thinking about, learning outcomes, purpose and tool. Purposes and tools. Okay, so this is the last thing I want to say. So again, is Bellarmine talking about the different things you can think about when we are engaging with tools and how we engage with those tools to help us ourselves in the process. I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to stop the recording here. And I want to ask